Hey everybody, I'm Virginia Soares, or Jen. I am working with you this week on the module about grading contracts and contract grading. So this is called a deep dive into assessments and contract grading in the COVID-19 pandemic. And this module is provided through the Jedi Writing Pie. So I am assistant professor of English, and I'm also a Metro faculty affiliate. This is my first year at San Francisco State. As an undergraduate, I graduated from San Diego State, and then I got a master's degree at Long Beach State. So I'm from Southern California, and it's just so great to be back in California and come home and work in an institution like one where I graduated from. So I'm really excited to work with you all and talk about grading. You might see me get really excited about grading. I think it's really important, and it's also interesting to talk about. I see grading and feedback and assessment as ways really to build relationships with students and talk about progress in the course. Unfortunately, I know that assessment is used to uphold structural inequalities and institutional hierarchies, and that it's often used for exclusive purposes that harms students. So I'm hoping that by watching this module and participating in the conversation this week, that you'll have an opportunity to think about ways that you can really interrogate your own assessment practices, no matter what kind of assessment you use in your classroom, and think about ways to continuously better serve your students. So my goal is to get you familiar and comfortable with grading contract. However, my goal is not to convert you. I'd just be happy if you know a colleague who's using contract grading, and you could maybe ask them questions and communicate with them and support them. Or you might take aspects of this week and apply it to your own teaching, again, no matter what kind of assessment structure that you're using. So I feel like there's good ideas for everybody in this module, I hope, and I'll go ahead and get started. Welcome. So the pre-thinking, pre-writing activity, you probably benefit from taking a little time to think about this before going too deeply into the module, just so that you can have your own ideas coming in and really critically self-reflect about some of the beliefs and values that you have walking into the classroom. So the first question is, how did your ideas about grading form? So like, what are the memories, the experiences that you have as a student that you carry with you into the classroom all over again as a teacher? A lot of times we talk about how we teach the way that we were taught, or that we're teachers in a particular discipline or subject because we were good in those subjects and we made it and we were successful. So think about your ideas about grading and grades and how they make you feel, and how that might match or be different from the students who are walking into your classroom. The second question is, how do your beliefs and values about teaching play out in different aspects of your classroom? So I'll talk a little bit about pedagogy, curriculum, and assessment, and how those form a triangle to kind of like enact the environment or the situation in your classroom. So how do your beliefs and values play out through those different aspects? The third question is, this semester with COVID-19 and distance learning, how are we, if at all, accounting for absences, late work, missed work, participation, writing process steps, etc., in equitable ways? What counts as the labor in your class? So how are you determining those end of course grades for your students this year? And what about the choices that you're making maybe now would carry over to your courses when we all meet again in person? So again, thinking about how we structure our classes to determine those students' end of course grades. So before we start this module off, I'd like to start off the assessment with an assessment. So think about how you feel about assessment. Assessment is a necessary evil imposed by institutions and our economic system. B, meh, kind of a drag, but whatever. C, super fun, I love it. Or D, an integral part of teaching and learning that reflects my authentic values. So I thought I'd start off by talking a little bit about assessment narratives. Assessment narratives are the stories that we tell ourselves about grading and grades and how our own educational histories shape our beliefs and values to define our pedagogical choices. So I teach the way I was taught. Assessment narratives are the ways in which we explore or we don't explore grading as a value-laden practice. So again, think about how your ideas that you have now about grading formed. What experiences as a student did you have? What experiences as a graduate student did you have? What early teaching experiences are you having or had? And how have those solidified or maybe been uprooted and changed over time? I bring this up because I feel like we have so much to offer the students in our classes, but we also have to acknowledge that we bring in with us some baggage too, and we are always limited by our own experiences and how those experiences shape what we take in the classroom, what we see, the questions even that we think to ask. So sometimes getting into a routine, especially I've been teaching for 12 years, especially over time. Up until this year, I had the same syllabus and I would just kind of fill in the blanks. And so I think about like, what in that language or what in those choices that I made to present myself kind of carried over from term to term. And I wasn't even really aware of it. For me too, thinking about my experiences as a student, the one that probably informed my feelings about grades and grading the most was actually what happened in 8th grade PE. And what's useful for me is to think about the classes where and the topics where I've felt like kind of a loser, like I don't know what I'm doing. I'm very much a beginner, and I'm hypersensitive and self-conscious and scared about my performance. So in 8th grade PE, the way that class was graded was for progress, and progress in theory sounds really great, right? So on the first day of PE, 8th grade PE, we had to run a mile. And of course, if the class is measured on progress, every single week we'd run a mile and you're graded based upon your improvement week to week. So on the very first day of PE, we would just walk the track. Why would you run your best mile on the first day if that's going to hold the standard that the teacher is measuring you against for the entire rest of the term? What if you don't feel good? What if you have a bad performance? It just felt like there wasn't any room to grow. So we would walk the track. And I always thought about, as somebody who was very terrible at PE and athletics, what would have happened if there was a grading structure where I could try my best on the first day and go from there, and not try to stage or script this idea of progress just for the grade. And I wish I would have had an opportunity to do that. And I feel like maybe I would have grown and improved and not felt so bad about PE for so long. I also think about how I was tracked without knowing it into the basic level mathematics class when other freshmen in high school that I knew were all tracked into classes with upper level students. I think about how I didn't even know I was taking that test, and to this day, I don't actually know how I was placed. Yet I was placed in the AP English class for some reason too, and I don't know how that happened either. And look what happened. I became an English major and an English professor and an English teacher, and not a math person. And to this day, I still struggle with having any confidence around basic level math. I also think about kindergarten when I forgot my homework one day. And I remember this very clearly. I had to watch all my friends go out and play at recess without me because I had to sit at the wall as punishment for forgetting my homework. And just like those feelings of like messing up, to me, never really helped me grow or learn or want to be better. They always just felt like what's the point? um and I think especially those topics or those courses or those situations where I had like a very thin connection to whatever I was doing, it was very easy for me to kind of quit and check out. And I think about that a lot for the undergraduates I teach now, who have a very sometimes a very complex and difficult relationship to writing, because of their prior experiences and school, and not feeling valued or welcomed or a sense of belonging or affirmation in the prior classes that they've been in. And they bring those assessment narratives into the class too. So one way to start with contract grading, or really any kind of grading, is to not only be transparent with students about what you're doing and why, but maybe actually like nerd out a little bit with them and be vulnerable and talk about some of the things that happened to you in school and invite them to share their own experiences, so that these conversations around assessment are destigmatized and valued, and people know that sometimes systems are at play, and sometimes things just aren't going to go your way or are not your fault, and it's the way that things are set up for you. And so this helps students develop some sort of like vocabulary around assessment. And as you go through your grading contract in the first day or the first week or throughout the term, or whatever form of assessment you're using, building in these narratives or building in these ways of critically reflecting on what we're doing and why, and how that's valued or not valued, can be really helpful for students to develop an assessment literacy for their other classes that'll serve them throughout their educational journey. So that's kind of like one strand of theory we could go down. There's also other opportunities that contract grading and alternative forms of assessment, other ungrading practices open up. These are some of the ways, the reasons why people move away from traditional grades. And I want to emphasize here that there's multiple logics at play, and some are overlapping, but some teachers move away from grades for very specific reasons. And so I'll just go over some of the possibilities here, and you might think about kind of where you stand and where your frustration with grading may be. So a concern is that, especially in writing intensive courses, or courses where you do want to emphasize that process of learning, that grades replace formative feedback. So grades as a summative end of product determination replace feedback that can really benefit students throughout. Or there's just a grade and it's a shortcut for the communication that could be happening along the way. Grades also tend to vary from teacher to teacher, subject to subject. So the idea here is that sometimes grades don't actually work to communicate the way that we think that they're doing. And so replacing more formative feedback with those grades can really harm students who may not really understand what grades mean or what you intend to communicate. Also, a concern is that grades create false hierarchies that do not further collaborative learning environments. So again, students start to internalize their grades and feel like they're either good at something or not. And it can be really hard to kind of recover or redirect that thinking. Grades are extrinsic motivators that do not support intrinsic motivation or student success. So a lot of students, I fell into this too as a student, where I just wanted the A's, and students have very good reasons for wanting those grades because a lot of times money, scholarships, fellowships, athletics, lots of different things can be tied to those grades, and those grades are very, very high stakes. But we should also be thinking about how to cultivate that intrinsic motivation so that students are able to find a connection to the material and kind of see themselves in whatever disciplines or areas of knowledge that we're teaching. And find something that they can work towards besides an A. Another concern is that grades are arbitrary and vary greatly from person to person, moment to moment. And so a lot of times grades are just unfair to students, and students don't necessarily know how to make sense of them. And sometimes teachers have a hard time making sense of them too. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. Another reason, especially in writing classes right now, or English classes or writing intensive courses, is that when you are assessing writing, either assessing the writing itself or using writing to assess the topic that you're teaching, like through an end of class final essay, for example. The critique is that grades are based on dominant linguistic and behavioral standards and norms that privilege white students, or students who have had access to academic language, which is code for being usually white, middle, upper class, affluent students. And Asao Inoue calls this white language supremacy. And in some of the contract grading classes too, teachers will actually bring in this topic of white language supremacy or racism and bias in writing and in grading, and actually present it to students to kind of problematize and work through and talk about, so that they are aware that this is a conversation, and this is something that they might be informed about. So that's a whole list of reasons. And again, there's just so much variation depending on your own concerns, classroom culture, and context. And the way that you set up a grading contract is going to depend on some of the initial problems you had with traditional style grading, and the solutions that you think are most valuable for addressing those concerns. So in a sense, it's actually kind of hard to define contract grading because it varies so much from teacher to teacher, class to class, sometimes there's just as much variation in contract grading as any other form of classroom assessment. But I'm going to try my best to kind of come up with a definition, a working definition for us for this module. So contract grading refers specifically to how you arrive at the student's end of course grade. So for that reason, contract grading can be combined with portfolio grading. It can be combined with a variety of other kind of like curriculum choices, pedagogy choices. It can be combined with lots of different kinds of assessment choices too, like feedback isn't necessarily tied to the type of contract grading, although they tend to be kind of related because you want your whole classroom to be working together as a system. But contract grading really just refers to how you get the student's end of course grade. And so I think that that's important to acknowledge, because if you're interested in contract grading or other forms of ungrading and alternative assessment, you'll find that a lot of these things are actually compatible with each other. And a lot of them come from the same concerns in the same places, and can be combined with one another. So basically for contract grading, the idea is that students complete an X number of assignments or learning tasks to earn a specific Y grade, rather than partial points or percentages for each project. Okay. So the idea is that you're de-emphasizing grades on individual projects. So process, steps, and behaviors may be incorporated, and this varies so much from teacher to teacher. Some teachers really value labor-based. It's called a labor-based style of contract grading. And many times their labor in the class, like hours logged or word counts, tend to be incorporated into an assignment to make it either pass or no pass, acceptable, revise. Behaviors sometimes too are also incorporated, like late work or absences, which we may want to think about too in COVID-19 and distance learning, but I've actually begun to think about that a lot more in general too. And as you're making these strategic choices too, it's kind of like as you're determining what counts and what doesn't count, and how you're measuring what and how that figures into the student's end of course grade, inevitably some choices are going to provide affordances and constraints for a group of students, and then those same choices will provide other affordances and constraints to different students. So like if you value attendance, that's going to privilege some students and disadvantage others. If you privilege having work on time, that's going to privilege some students and it's going to disadvantage others. So process, steps, and behaviors may be incorporated just like normal assessments. Just thinking about like how the teacher incorporates those, and then also incorporates different assignments in the class to get that end grade for students. And as I said, because assignments do not tend to, some people do, but most assignments do not tend to have partial points or percentages or A through F grades. Individual assignments are ungraded. They tend to be pass or no pass. And most teachers who use contract grading really want to emphasize that revision component. And so if something's not passing, there'll be detailed feedback and sort of like, or a conversation and a way to get that student to redo the assignment to be at passing level. So like a lot of critiques to contract grading, will say something like, oh, anything goes, quality doesn't matter, but that's actually not true at all. It's just that the gradients for quality, the ways that quality is being conceptualized are a little bit different in the pass, no pass. And then once something is passing, typically it counts towards that that grading contract and the total grade that students are getting for the class. A lot of teachers have negotiation and choice aspects possible. So some teachers will present a rough draft contract and get feedback. Anonymous feedback is always good, or have a conversation on the first day negotiating. Some teachers do this from scratch. Some teachers do not negotiate the end of course grading contract, like the stuff that students need to do in order to get an A, B, C in the class, but they'll actually negotiate rubrics on individual assignments. So there's lots of variation in the negotiation and choice as well. And then hybrids are also possible. And so with some contracts, teachers may grade A through F. And there's a way to kind of like do that and have assignments still count towards the end of course grade, or again, the way that those A through F grades are determined are very like based on conversations with the class. But that's pretty uncommon. With the hybrids, usually it's more of a teachers just deciding that they want to have more pass, no pass, or ungraded assignments throughout the course so that students have an opportunity to practice in a low stakes or in a low stress environment. And so that's usually what hybrid refers to. Hybrid can also refer to, there's a version of contract grading where everything's pass, no pass, but a student needs to do a quality according to the teacher work in order to get the A grade. These are a lot of details. You don't need to remember them all. The important thing, again, to just think about is there's lots and lots of choices within grading contracts, and you can set yours up lots of different ways depending on your beliefs and values. But again, the central kind of like part about contract grading is typically you're not grading A through F or points and percentages individual projects, and the emphasis is more on formative feedback and summative feedback. And yes, there's an end grade for the transcript. And I know at San Francisco State, we need to give students end grades at the end of the semester. So it's really just a way to get to that end of course grade. And the idea is that students choose the amount of work or choose the amount of learning tasks or choose the path in order to get the grade that they want for the class. All right, so just to emphasize these different logics and moving away from grades, here are a couple quotes, and these are all worth reading, and I'll put links in this week's module too if you're curious. Peter Elbow says, based on my long training in composition and my extensive experience in teaching writing and my careful examination of your paper, I feel quite confident in saying there's a 60% likelihood that it is a C+. So Peter Elbow says that, and he wants to emphasize the unreliability of traditional grading systems, where sometimes our grades are different, especially if it's a heavy writing class or there's process steps measured. Sometimes we have to make those judgments about writing. And if there is a whole spectrum of grading, or if there's an assignment that's like 0 to 100 points, for example, every single one of those 100 points, or every single one of those grades, the A minus, B plus, B, those are all decision points. And so sometimes those can vary depending on the student's placement in the stack, or how many papers we've seen or read, or what our expectations are in that moment or in that day, or I hate to say it, but like maybe even if we're hungry. So there can be a lot of variety in the ways that people assess writing or assess learning through writing. And I mean, if you've ever been to a department norming session, yeah, you might agree with me there. So the next quote is from Jesse Stomel, and he says, Can we imagine assessment mechanisms that encourage discovery? Ones not designed for assessing learning, but designed for learning through assessment. So Jesse Stomel, who does a lot of work on ungrading, if you want to Google him and ungrading, he has fantastic materials for thinking about moving away from the logics of grades. And his idea is that assessment should be used for learning. And that quote, actually, can we imagine assessment mechanisms? I actually put that at the top of my grading contract to kind of like frame my grading contract for students. And then this next quote is Jerry Farber talking about the message that grades sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally send to students. So you can tell students anything you want about taking responsibility and thinking for yourself. The grading system you employ, a middle finger extended before them, is always more eloquent still. And then Asao Inoue talks about anti-racist assessment specifically, and he makes a lot of moves and choices in his classroom to pair grading contracts and this idea of not grading individual assignments with a larger, he calls it an ecology, an anti-racist ecology. So lots of practices that he does around journaling and labor logs, and the curriculum is centered around anti-racism and white language supremacy. So his grading contract is situated in a much larger class, and students who are in his classes always feel the grading contract or the ecology around anti-racism and anti-racist assessment. Some of the other teachers, depending, and again, this is a choice you want to make, you can decide, do I want my grading contract to essentially like drive the curriculum of the course? If you're doing like a writing course or a first year comp course, if you are teaching in a different discipline, like in a STEM discipline, I could definitely see ways to talk about bias and merit, and how merit is socially constructed in your discipline. And one of the ways to invite students into that is through a grading contract, because the contract is kind of an example of really problematizing how standards and how merit is formed. So as Sal says, framing standards as racialized. If we present the standards schools require our students to mimic as white language habits that automatically privilege some students and set other students up to fail, then we can investigate these standards and problems, paradoxes in judgment, and not in deficiencies in students. So again, sometimes students internalize this failure, like it's my fault, or it's something that I did, or honestly, sometimes classroom systems are just not intended, unfortunately, to serve a wide number of students. And that can be along race, that can be along gender, language, disability. So always consistently thinking about how we can make choices that benefit students and their learning, especially in assessment structures, which have the potential to be so helpful, but also so harmful, is a really important aspect, I think, of teaching. So I just wanted to point out that the way that I see contract grading being used, again, you can kind of choose how you view it, but the different underlining logics, these concerns that these teachers and professors and scholars have about their students and their classes, that forms your core, that will form your core teaching philosophy, your beliefs and values. And so I think it can be really, really cool to think about how those beliefs and values live out through your curriculum. And we do talk about having like a more culturally responsive, inclusive curriculum. Pedagogy, and I think that we do talk about teaching practices and ways that we can be more more responsive to students. And then the missing piece to me is often assessment. So what can we do for assessment so that assessment is another way that we can live out our beliefs and values about teaching, which if you're in the Jedi training or the Jedi Pi Institutes, you've been thinking a lot about the justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, thinking about how those values can play out through assessment is really important. So how are your curriculum, your pedagogy and assessment related to how do they shape or enact your teaching philosophy? And that's something that you can continuously think about it. For me, I know that it's never over. Like there's always more room to learn and grow. And my grading contract changes pretty much every single term. So there's a lot of variation in grading contracts. So for that reason, I think of grading contracts as a genre, an assessment genre. And again, depending on your motivation for wanting to use them or for wanting to ungrade, teachers tend to call them different things. So this also makes it a little hard when you're first getting into the practice or you want to just learn more. People call grading contracts different things, both in the like official, I guess, like literature and journals and conversations at conferences, but also just in the hall. And sometimes the name is chosen to kind of protect what you're doing because you might feel like you could be targeted as a lecture faculty or as someone without tenure. And so sometimes people will make choices about labels based on that. Other times people just really resist the idea of a contract because it sounds very legalese and it doesn't sound like a social justice interaction. And so if you haven't seen the grading contract, if you haven't liked many of the grading contract models that you've seen, it might be because sometimes grading contracts are used in a very contracty way and they tend to be very directive and very kind of coercive too. So making sure like as you're flipping through models that the grading contracts are not enacting the logics that you're looking to get away from. But there's lots of examples out there. They can be called learning records, grading records. Sometimes it's the word grading actually that people want to push against. So I have a colleague that calls her grading system actually just grading goals. So I did a research project last year, and I just wanted to quickly bring up a couple things that I found in case that they can serve us and our conversation here. So I interviewed 20 teachers and I collected, actually I did a survey and I got 135 responses. So I got to talk to multiple teachers who use grading contracts, which was really, really cool. And I'll highlight some of the things that I feel could be relevant to this conversation. So for those using labor-based, and again, this is like a buzzword right now, labor-based, labor can mean a whole lot of different things, and labor-based tends to be tied to a specific model of anti-racist grading contracts that ASAO in a way does. But I found that anti-racism was actually not a central concern or a central theory that was expressed in the grading contracts. I also found, that there's a disconnect between literature and practice. So again, like people's ideas about anti-racism, people's ideas about what negotiation looks like, whether it's in individual assignments or in the holistic end of course grading contract itself, or even the word labor-based. Those are all those terms have a lot of slippage. So as you're getting into grading contract or as you're pursuing it more, just keep in mind that when somebody uses these terms, it's good to kind of like clarify what they mean, since it seems like they're being used differently. I also found that the Xerox effect is extremely common. People often inherit grading contracts from their professors. I mean, I talked earlier about the baggage that we bring into the classroom from our own undergraduate's degree. And one of the baggages, I guess, that I bring in is that I was a student in a contract grading class as a undergraduate. And so I brought in like this idea of grading contracts when my own teaching was not working right. So I emailed my professor at San Diego State, Jerry Farber, who used grading contracts. And I Xeroxed basically, I mean, I use that word to describe just kind of copying and pasting his grading contract into my own class. And so that can be a common thing. And I don't think that that's bad. I think if you want to use someone else's contract, that can be a great way to start. But just be mindful again about whether we're Xeroxing other teachers or Xeroxing our own practices from term to term, how important it is to stop and critically thinking about the choices that are embedded or the ideologies that are embedded in those documents that we may inadvertently repeat over time. I also found out that a lot of people failed the first time. There are some good articles to read. I always think like a good way to start contract grading is to read about why people fail and really lean into it. A lot of times students just are confused and they're not clear about what they're supposed to do in order to get the A or the high grade in the course or to pass. So one thing that really helped though was that I found a lot of teachers just in the field nationally who use grading contracts try to find other teachers who use them, and they may have support groups so that you can consistently be revising your practices and workshopping your choices, and then and talking to people who are kind of doing similar things to you. It's also just nice, you know, to talk to other teachers so that when you're feeling down or you feel like something's not working, you can have somebody tell you you're a winner and keep going. Unfortunately, though, 46% of the people who responded and responded specifically to this answer, 59 out of 129 teachers reported no support. So either no outside like social support from other teachers or no support for their institutions. Again, there's lots and lots of variation in design here. So I won't go over this in too much detail here, but this is available for you. So if you're kind of thinking about, well, this sounds okay, like I might try this, I might move away from grading individual assignments, or I might restructure the way that I determine students' end of course grades. These are some patterns I'm finding. The grid style of a grading contract has different student behaviors and different assignments, and it's a grid so that you go down the column and the row and students kind of locate their grade there. So it's a way of measuring multiple different aspects of a student's performance to come up with an end of course grade. There's also the linear style where it's more of a, to get the C, it's maybe at the bottom or, you know, on one side. And then after those requirements are met, students can move up to a B, and then they do additional work and it's an A. So it's sort of this predetermined path. And usually there's only like one or two things on each grading tier so that students kind of move up or move over in a linear way. There's also multiple pathways, and that's what I've actually started doing. because with COVID-19, I realized like normally I'll have students, let's just say like do a book report or do a resume or something. And then the next step, they do this other thing, like they have to do a presentation. And then to move up another grade, they have to do an essay. And I realized like, especially in COVID-19, I don't want that presentation to be a barrier to someone doing well in the course, when they could maybe choose something that better suits their needs and circumstances and meets the same outcomes. And so now I have sort of like the core requirements. C is for core requirements, and then students opt into different assignments, and they can kind of like choose their own way of moving through the grading system up to the A if that's the grade that they want. So I'll throw it out to you all too. This semester with COVID-19 distance learning, how are we, if at all, accounting for absences, late work, missed work, participation, writing process steps, and how are we doing that in equitable ways that benefit all students in their learning? And then what counts as labor in your class? So are you counting absences? How are you negotiating live Zoom sessions? Are you offering makeup, iLearn posts? Like what kinds of activities and assignments are you expecting your students to do? And again, sometimes people count behavior like absences and late works into that labor of the course that makes their final grade. So if you actually want to see some documents, I put some up in our goodie bag of resources in the module, and that will help you get started. This is sort of like a theoretical introduction, and it may help to actually look at different versions of contracts. So I hope that this quick overview will enable you to do that and recognize some of the rhetorical moves that I've emphasized here. I also put in 2 optional reflection worksheets. So if this sounds cool to you and you want to get started, there's one where you kind of like put what activities and assignments you have in your class, and where you want them to be valued. And you can start thinking about how you might transition from a traditional grading system to more of a contract grading one. And then I also have another reflection worksheet that I designed that just asks you critical questions about your assessment choices. And that can be used for any kind of assessment that you're doing. And I'm here to support you. Dan is here to support you, and Jolie is here to support you. We all use contract grading at State, and we are happy to geek out with you.